We are currently in the 21st chapter. This has been a section in which Jesus has been teaching on the end times and things to come. This is often referred to as the Olivet Discourse because Jesus is teaching this to his disciples as they are sitting on the slope of the Mount of Olives just 2 nights before his crucifixion. And so this is what we have been in for a number of weeks. And we are now in verses 25 through 28 for this morning. And this is a passage specifically now about the return of Christ. In fact, even more specifically, this is a passage about the various signs that will accompany his return. And so this is a challenging passage in several different ways, but at the same time, this is a needed passage. And this is one that I am looking forward to unpacking with you in our time here this morning. And so again, this is Luke chapter 21. And verses 25 through 28. Let me just read these words for us just to get them before us. Here's what Jesus says about this coming time. Luke 21, verse 25, he says, "And there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and of the waves, men fainting from fear, and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world. For the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads, for your redemption is drawing near." Let me just begin here this morning by saying that the life of a pastor is multifaceted. It is variegated. Every week is wildly different. But I think probably what I face, perhaps more than anything else, is the reality of what I'll just call wandering hearts of Christians, true Christians. And so what I try to do as a pastor, for those who will let you speak into their life, is I try to, as the song we sang this morning said, bind their wandering hearts back to the gospel, back to the Word of God. Probably a week doesn't go by in which somebody needs to meet, somebody needs to talk about an issue in their life that is creating some kind of anxiety, some kind of fear, some kind of worry. Could be something big, could be something small, but it's a crisis of the mind that is producing within them some kind of vexation, and it's beginning to pull on their heart. I see this. For others, it's not necessarily a worry that's pulling on their hearts as much as it is just some kind of distraction, some kind of pursuit, something they're chasing, something they're running after, which by the way, is a kind of wandering that never just happens overnight. Rather, it's that slow but inevitable pull on the heart until their heart and their soul and their mind and their strength is captivated and absorbed by some pursuit. And so the question for me is, so why does that happen? How does that happen? It happens the way that it always happens, which is by a person ceasing to keep before their eyes an eternal perspective, of forgetting to live with the end in mind. Come to a passage this morning that is all about the end. It's all about things to come, and it is one that has been given to us by the mercy and the grace of Christ to help fix our eyes on the end. It gives to us an eternal perspective. And this is a graphic passage. It's a difficult passage, not only in terms of interpretation, but in terms of its intent. That is to say, what Christ is seeking to get done within our own hearts. And this is a cosmic text. This is a passage of literally epic proportions. In fact, again, we've been looking at this passage in which Jesus has been predicting many things that are to come. In fact, this started back in verse 8. Remember, the disciples asked Jesus questions about things to come. Jesus responds then with the longest answer that he gives to any question in all of the gospel records. And what he's been doing is laying out the future of this world. And he has been laying it out, but from the perspective of the first century. And so he began to describe the experience of the apostolic age. And he began predicting things to come for the apostles, things that they would experience: suffering, difficulty, opposition, ultimately death. He predicted all kinds of experiences that they would face, which of course would become typical then of the church age. Then in verse 20, he began to describe the fall of Jerusalem in particular, and therefore the destruction of the temple, which of course was an act of judgment upon Israel for failing to embrace Jesus as their Messiah. And then last time we came to verse 24, where Jesus began to talk about, in the second half of verse 24, what he labels there as the times of the Gentiles, which again was a technical phrase for what we've been in for at least 2,000 years at this point. It was a phrase speaking of the church age. In fact, Matthew refers to it in his version as the time in which the gospel of the kingdom of God is going to be preached to the nations. And so this is what we've been in for the past 2,000 years. In fact, if you want to know where you are in this text, it's right there in the second half of verse 24. This has been the time in which Jesus has been building his church, as he has been saving people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And yet what we also saw was that this was a time that would not last forever. In fact, Paul says in Romans chapter 11, in verse 26, he says that this is the times of the Gentiles, but until, key word, but until the full number of the Gentiles comes in, talking about the church and all whom God intends to save. And so as we come now this morning to verse 25, Jesus will give to us the very next event on the eschatological timetable. And what is that event? Well, it is his own return. This is Jesus' teaching on his own second coming. And so what he does is he moves now into some descriptions that will accompany this event. And it is a graphic text. Now, I don't know what your thoughts have always been about the return of Jesus. I don't know if you think he's just going to sort of show up to you personally, privately. If he's just going to sort of float out of heaven, unassuming, with a glow, meek and mild. But the Bible describes his return, and specifically the events leading up to his return and that accompany his return and that are associated tightly with his return, as a time of unprecedented global upheaval. In fact, the scene here is described in terms of deep dismay among the entire world over global events that are coming upon it. And these are events that will begin to overturn and then unravel the very natural order of this world. And so you're going to have to use your imagination with me a little bit this morning as we work through this. But if you can picture some of the things that Jesus is describing, then what you have here is perhaps, I think, one of the most frightening passages in all of Scripture. And what he's revealing are the signs, as he labels it, that will indicate that he is about to come. In fact, what we have here are just a few short verses, but they're very important to understand. And because the reality is, if Jesus begins to come in your lifetime, then you need to be understanding the times. You need to understand and know the signs of the time. You need to be able to interpret what's coming upon the world, but so that you won't fall into despair or some kind of unbelief when this globe, as we know it, begins to unravel. And because this is what's coming. In fact, there's going to be a fracturing of all that we know to be normal. And so unless you understand what is really going on, then you will not be able to interpret the events without becoming hopeless. This is a description of the world in chaos. This is the world in panic. This is going to be a time of deep, deep horror and fear. And so for any who do not understand what is going on, which, by the way, will be most of the world, most people, they will enter into a state of hopelessness. And is this describing some kind of tribulational period? Well, without question. Now, is this a literal 7-year tribulation, as some people talk about? Well, the text doesn't say that. But what it does say is that these circumstances are inextricably tied to the return of Christ. This is the point. And so let's take a look at what Jesus here is calling the signs of his return. These are the signs of his return. And so notice, first of all, verse 25, and there's a few of them in this text, and we'll just kind of walk through these verses organically. But notice, first of all, he says that his return will be preceded, or at least accompanied, by what we'll just call celestial signs. These are the celestial signs. And so notice he says that there will be signs, but where? Well, in the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, what does that phrase mean? What are these signs in the sun and the moon and the stars? Well, notice he doesn't actually tell us. And the question that you should ask is, why doesn't he explain it? Well, the answer is because he doesn't need to. And why doesn't he need to? Well, because these disciples to whom he's talking would have known exactly what he's talking about. And how would they have known that? Well, because Jesus here, he's not just making this up. Rather, he is pulling this directly from the Old Testament. In fact, let me give to you just some of those texts. There are several of them that we could look at. We could spend this entire sermon this morning looking at just these Old Testament passages, but I'll just give you a couple of them. But in Joel chapter 2, for example, and this morning, if you're able to flip to these texts, go for it. If you can't, just listen. But Joel chapter 2, the prophet here is speaking of the coming Messiah, things that would accompany the coming Messiah. And remember, the Old Testament prophets, they closely associated the coming of the Christ with judgment. They closely associated it with what they would often call the day of the Lord, which is a technical phrase used to speak of the Messiah and his coming judgment. And the day of the Lord, it was certainly a day of rescue for his people, but it was a day of judgment for those who were not. And so they describe over and over again this day of the Lord, and it's a day of wrath in which he will come and pour out wrath on all who reject him. And so he says these words, Joel chapter 2, in verse 30, he says, "And I will display wonders in the sky, and on the earth blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord." And the key word here is the word before. So before the great and awesome day of the Lord, there's going to be these events that precede his coming and are associated with it. And then he says in chapter 3 and verse 14, he says, "For the day of the Lord," there's that phrase, "is near in the valley of decision." And then this, "the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars will lose their brightness." And so here we have the language of the sun and the moon and the stars, and they're describing a time in which the universe as we know it is going to go black. He says that they will lose their brightness. See it as well in Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13, and this is a devastating text. Isaiah 13 in verse 9, Isaiah here as well is very clear that the day of the Lord will be accompanied by signs involving changes in the celestial bodies. And the sign specifically is that the lights will go out. And so he says these words, Isaiah 13 and verse 9. He says, "And behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and it will be cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it." This is what God will do. And so what's going to happen in verse 10? "Well, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light, and the sun will be dark when it rises, and the sun will not shed its light. And then I will punish the world for its evil." So notice, not just Israel, but now the entire world. "But I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal men scarcer than pure gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir." And then he adds this, which Joel doesn't have, but he says, verse 13, "Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken from its place. And it will happen by the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger." Literally in the Hebrew, the day of his burning nostrils. So again, this is going to be a time of wrath, a time of judgment, unprecedented judgment, which is going to be kicked off by the darkening of these celestial bodies. And that is a literal description, by the way, of the sun and the moon and the stars. They will no longer give their light. There's going to be some kind of alteration to the natural order as we know it. And yet how will by the special hand of God who holds all these things together. This is going to be some kind of alteration. And you ask, well, how is this going to work itself out from a scientific perspective? What's going to cause this blackness? How can the sun just go out? Well, this is the point. This is going to be an unnatural deordering of creation. In fact, not only will there be total blackness, but Isaiah there indicates as well that this will affect our closed system of our world. He says that this earth will be shaken. In fact, if the sun is going to go out, it will have massive implications on this world, right? So think everything from ecosystems to tide patterns to unstable temperatures to the swelling of oceans. There's going to be an incredible disruption to life and process. If our sun's going to be thrown off, the moon's going to be thrown off. If the moon's going to be thrown off, so will our tides, all of our oceans. This will have devastating consequences. The earth will be shaken, he says. In fact, again, this is why you're not going to have to wonder if Jesus has come back. You will know it. This is the kind of stuff that will precede it and be attached to it. In fact, it's why he said back in verse 8 of Luke 21 of our text, he says that if someone says to you that I am he or that the time is near, do not go after him. Why? You're not going to need to check it out. In fact, if you have questions as to whether or not Jesus is returning, it's not it. You will know it. In fact, let me also just say that this is why you don't need to worry about third temples and red heifers and peace treaties in the Middle East. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But the signs here, notice that language. The signs that you're to be looking for are what? Cosmic. You will know Jesus is about to return. This universe will go black. These are the signs, he says. And so what is this going to do? We'll notice the progression, second half of verse 25. This will result, understandably, in a full-scale panic. Second half of verse 25. So there's going to be sign in the suns and the moons and the stars. But on earth, notice, dismay, where? Among nations. Dismay among nations. And you should read there, dismay among all the nations. This is going to be global. In fact, the term here for dismay, it's a word that speaks of distress. It's a term in the original that speaks of being chained, but in a psychological kind of way. And so it's the idea of being trapped or tormented, but in the mind. In other words, this world's going to be thrown into a kind of psychological distress, panic, anguish, due to the fear of what's coming upon the world. In fact, notice how it's phrased, very interesting. He says that this will be distress or dismay, but among the nations. And that preposition of among is very important. And because notice, when this stuff begins to take place, it's no longer distress between the nations, right? But rather within the nations. That is to say that all the wars and the rumors of the wars that are going to define the times of the Gentiles, as we saw in previous weeks, there's warnings that take place between nations. In a sense, that will cease. And why? Well, because the entire globe will be realizing that there is something far more deadly that is coming upon it. And that is not to say there won't be warring of nations between one another. There probably will be. But the point of emphasis is to say that every single nation is going to realize that there is a much bigger problem, a far bigger threat. There are things coming upon this world threatening to extinct them. In fact, the idea here of dismay among the nations, it may even speak here to how governments, official governments of nations will start to look to the experts to try and figure out what in the world is happening. In fact, if you could just imagine it, perhaps all these nations of the world are going to begin to scramble to gather for themselves all the best minds, all the best scientists, all the best experts, all the scholars, and yet what will be their conclusion? Dismay, distress, panic. Why? There will be no answers. In fact, notice the end of verse 25. There will be perplexity at the roaring of the sea and of the waves. The term perplexity, aparia, a term used to speak of being in dire straits. So literally no answer, no solution, no explanation. There will be such a breaking of this natural system that nothing will make sense. Chaos. And because this is going to defy everything that humans have ever known to be true about this known universe. In fact, perhaps this is in part what is meant in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 7. Let me just read it for you. Revelation chapter 8 and verse 7, John says this. He says, "And there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. And then something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became like blood. And a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life had died. And a third of the ships were destroyed. And a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell and on a third of the rivers and on the springs of the waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And a third of the waters became wormwood. And many men died from the waters because they were made bitter. So something's going to happen to the water supply. And a third of the sun and a third of the moon and a third of the stars were struck so that a third of them would be darkened. And the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way." So again, seismic shifts as the climate fractures radically. Tides are thrown off, currents thrown off, oceans thrown off, entire ecosystems being wiped out in just a moment potentially. This is going to be a frightening time, and especially because there's going to be no rational explanation, and because everything that has regulated this closed system is going to be turned upside down. It will be fractured. Devastating catastrophes. And our world has seen devastating catastrophes before, right? Hurricanes sweeping the shores of Japan, snuffing out millions of lives. Tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, droughts, famines, widespread disease. What is the point? The point is that none of that is going to be compared to the chaos yet to come in these final days. It will be beyond anything that this world has ever known, ever seen, or has had any kind of explanation for. Pure blackness, absolute chaos. In fact, the term here for roaring waves is the word ekos, from which we get the word echoes. The effect of what's going on in the oceans is going to carry far into the land. This will not affect just those who live on the shores. This is going to affect everybody. What is the point? The point is that everything in this world will come to a screeching halt. Right? Politics, industry, militaries, entertainment, science. This will be a time of full-scale panic in every nation. Anxiety-inducing for everybody. Everybody who does not know how to interpret what's going on. In fact, how bad will this be? Verse 26. He says, there will be men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world. For the powers of the heavens, plural, the power of the heavens will be shaken. Remember, in Scripture, there's 3 heavens. So the first heaven is the sky where the birds of the air fly. Second heavens is outer space. Third heavens is where God himself dwells. And so he is speaking here of the first and the second heavens. It's the chaos of what's going on in the celestial bodies that come to affect what's going on in our world. And so what is the result? How bad is this? Well, notice he says that men will be fainting from fear. Verse 26. That is a pretty domesticated translation. The term fainting here, apa psuko, 2 words. Apa, which means out of, and psuko, which means soul. Life principle. It's the idea of the life principle coming out of a person. What is that talking about? Death. This is the soul leaving the body. In fact, it's the picture here of people being scared literally to death. In fact, the King James renders it this way. It says, men's hearts failing from fear. People going into heart failure from shock. This is the result of complete hopelessness. Absolute dismay. There will be a depth of anxiety in people that is worse than any panic attack that they've ever experienced. You've got people here in mass potentially just dropping dead from fear. That this speaks to the level of hopelessness in view of what's coming upon the world. This is horror, distress, tribulation. Notice in verse 27. Just when people thought things are about to get worse, they all of a sudden get even worse. Notice what all of this leads to. He says, and then, tata, literally, at that time, a term of immediate sequence, but tied to the event. So at that time is a good way to translate it. What's going to happen? The return of Christ. Verse 27, then at that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now notice here, first of all, the term of they. So it's not you, as in the disciples that Jesus is talking to, but they. In other words, this is talking about the unbeliever, those who don't know how to interpret what's happening. And so in the midst of this unprecedented chaos, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now picture this scene here, but this is absolute blackness, no sun, no stars, no moon, no light. Pure darkness, pure chaos, people dropping dead, no answers, no explanation, certainly no solution. And then in the midst of abject darkness, the heavens split. And then into this blackness comes the blazing image of Christ in all of his eternal glory. And by the way, we don't know how long this chaos is going on for. Frankly, I can't imagine it's too long. How does the earth survive this any length of time? We don't know how long this is going on, a couple hours, a couple days, weeks, months. We don't know, it doesn't say. But this is what's going on. And then in the midst of hopelessness, the sky splits, and then a blinding light. Now, while this might seem like a moment of hope for this world and for this creation, kind of like, this is a terrible analogy, but like Gandalf coming for a rescue on the top of the slope at dawn. This will be a moment of great horror. And why? Well, because the they in verse 27 are who? Unbelievers. These are rejectors. These are those that Peter calls mockers in 2 Peter chapter 3, who could only mock Christians. And why are they mocking Christians in that text? Well, because everything in this world is appearing to be as it has always appeared since the beginning. And yet, what is the point of Peter? The point of Peter is to say the world really has appeared to be the way that it always has been from the beginning, but until the moment that it's not. In fact, he even compares it to those who mocked Noah for hundreds of years because he was building a boat. And they mocked him because up until that time, since the beginning of creation in Genesis, water never came out of the sky, right? It always came up from the ground as a mist. And so they mocked him until one day Noah got into his boat. And then what does God do? He slams the door shut and seals it, which was a slamming of a door in judgment. And then what happens? Well, some mocker standing outside the boat, all of a sudden, for the very first time, looks up and feels what? A drop on his forehead. Everything seemed to be as it always had been, but until it wasn't. And then global upheaval. What is the image here? Well, the image is that their anxiety over what's going on in the world will all of a sudden turn into a worse kind of horror. And why? Well, because they'll now be seeing the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who's arrived in his day of the Lord, and they will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he has come for judgment, for his wrath. In fact, I read it for you last week, but that great text of Revelation chapter 19 describes this moment in some very graphic ways. But John there says that when Jesus comes, he's going to come in war, right, with his armies. He will come with blazing eyes, the text says, which is speaking there of the purity of his assessments, and that out of his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, where the sword there coming out of his mouth, it's a metaphor speaking of the fact that he will judge in perfect righteousness, but by the word of his mouth, which is just another way of saying that he will judge in accord to the standards of his holy word. And it will be devastating for all who have refused to see him as Lord. In fact, Revelation 6 speaks of this moment as well. John here is talking about the 7 seals, if you're familiar with how the book of Revelation is structured. But with every opening of a seal comes a new aspect of God's judgment, a new aspect of his wrath, and it's unleashed, it's opened. And so when we get to the 6th seal, in chapter 6, it's a description of the return of Christ on the day of the Lord, and the entire thing is described as an unmitigated judgment. And so Revelation 6 and verse 12, John writes these words. He says, "And I looked, and when he broke the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when it's shaken by a great wind. And the sky was split apart like a scroll when it's rolled up. And every mountain and island were moved out of their places. So again, this is celestial disruptions that then bring natural disturbances upon the world. Even the very topography is altered. Severe disruption. Verse 15, and then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong, so all the mighty, all the noble, think presidents, dictators, generals, powerful billionaires. So all the kings of the earth and all the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and even every slave and free man, so just the commoner and those at the bottom, they hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us. Speaking there that of the fact that death would be more desirable than having to face judgment of God. But fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. And why? For the great day of their wrath has come. And who is able to stand? What is the point? The point is that everybody will know in an instant who Jesus is. No question. Or more to the point, they will understand in an instant his purpose in coming. Judgment. Who are these people? These are those who have rejected the free offer of grace. Those who have rejected deliverance while there was still time. Those who mocked, those who scorned the gospel. Even those who maybe didn't even overtly reject, just those who just didn't give much thought to God as God. Consumed by the pursuits of this world. In fact, the image here of Jesus coming on a cloud, back to Luke 21, it's actually a statement that is being pulled directly from Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel is prophesying of this moment, and it is a moment in which Daniel describes the Christ as coming in brilliance and in glory, and he is coming to establish his kingdom. In fact, it's a moment that the New Testament writers pick up on, and they refer to it as his epiphania, the term from which we get epiphany. It's a word which means literally to appear, but in a moment, and as if out of nowhere. So again, imagine the scene, complete darkness, but then the darkness is split, blinding light. And then Jesus appears shrouded in his eternal brilliance, which, by the way, will be opposite of everything of his first coming, right? Where he was shrouded in what? Humility, poverty, weakness, obscurity. Contrast couldn't be starker. This will be a coming defined by glory and riches and strength and might and all the omnipotent power of the holy and righteous sovereign God, and it will be an utter unveiling of the King of the universe, the one who right now holds the molecules of our bodies in their very place by his pleasure, his will, his power. In fact, in contrast to his first coming, there will be no question as to his identity. Everybody will know who he is in an instant. Zero question, zero obscurity, as all people will behold their Maker. And it will be a frightening moment for those who are not his. The instinct, Revelation 6, will be to run, hide like a bunch of insects when a rock is lifted up and exposed to the sun. There will be no hiding from this one who has eyes which see everything. And yet notice the contrast, verse 28. So you've got the they or the unbeliever, verse 27, but then notice 28. Notice the contrast with the adversative here of the word but. So he's addressing out his disciples. He says, but when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads. Why? For your redemption is drawing near. Now, by the way, the contrast here isn't between the response of the Christians and the response of the unbelievers at Jesus' coming, his actual appearing. Rather, the contrast here is between what the world does when the chaos begins and then what Christians are supposed to do when the chaos begins. In fact, notice how he even says it. He says that when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads. And what are these things? Well, it's a reference to the celestial bodies that go out. And when there's all kinds of panic and disorder in this universe, that is your cue to look up. In fact, again, when these things begin to take place, you are to look up. What does that imply? Well, it implies a little bit of time, right? Where look up here is a metaphor for have hope. When this world is in chaos, you should have hope. In fact, notice two commands given to the believer. He says, first of all, straighten up, which implies a kind of weariness, right? Perhaps weariness just from the Christian life, weariness from having to endure the opposition for needing to be faithful to the person of Christ. But then second, he commands to lift up their heads. So they're to look up. And I like the commands here, and because they're actually opposite of what the disciples were told to do back in Acts chapter 1, right? In fact, turn there if you can, quickly. Just Acts chapter 1, verse 9. This is the ascent of Jesus just after he spent 40 days with his disciples, after his resurrection. They are once again on the Mount of Olives, the very place to which Jesus will return. And he says this, he says, so when this is Acts 1:9, when the disciples had come together, they were asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time that you are restoring the kingdom of Israel? So they're still looking for the kingdom, right? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the remotest parts of the earth. In other words, there's going to be a mission now to accomplish, right? He's handing off the baton. Verse 9, and after he had said these things, I began in verse 5, but here's verse 9. He said these things, he was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky while he was going, behold, two men in white clothing stood beside them. And they also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into the sky? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in just the same way as you have watched him go into heaven. And then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount that is called Olivet. And then in just a few verses, we're in Acts chapter 2. What does that begin? Well, it begins the great mission, right? They receive power from on high as the Holy Spirit is poured out. And so beginning in Jerusalem, they begin to take the gospel to the nations. And so back in Luke 21:28, what is the implication of straighten up, lift up your heads? Well, the implication is that the mission is now over. This is done. And by the way, in contrast to the horror that'll come upon the unbeliever, the tenor of this verse for the believer is one of unbelievable hope. In fact, again, the language of straighten up, it implies weariness. They're bent over. Weariness from the mission, the long mission of the church. Time of persecution, opposition, hostility, slaughter, and all on account of the name. Like as Christians, we're commanded to endure, right? This is what we saw, verse 19, but with the appearing of Christ, that weariness from having to endure will cease. In fact, the word here of redemption, it's a first century word that speaks of a buyer who would enter into a slave market and then purchase for himself slaves. They were redeemed, bought. And so the biblical writers, they would often pick up on that word, but then use it in a wonderful way to speak of Christ, who has purchased us from the shackles of the slave market of sin in this world. And then what does he do? Well, he brings us home. And he brings us home not as slaves, but as sons and daughters of the kingdom, who will be fellow inheritors of the estate, right? With Christ. In fact, what I love about this passage is the contrast. There's a great contrast here between the theme of fear and the theme of hope. There's the fear of and shaking of the unbeliever over all the horrors of what they're experiencing as these things are coming upon the world, and yet there's an incredible hope for the Christian as they know how to interpret the times. They understand what these signs mean. When everything goes black, what does the Christian do? Well, that is their cue to understand that their faith in some way very soon is about to turn into sight. And let me just say that this is Jewish apocalyptic language. And so how this specifics here of all this work itself out in detail, we're not told. In fact, that's actually what's built into the nature of Jewish apocalyptic language. It's that while it unveils, apocalypse unveils and gives us truth, in some way it's still veiled. That is its purpose. You can only push it so far until you're in pure speculation. But we're told at this point that when these things begin to take place, and again, the point is you're not going to miss it. You will not wonder, what are you supposed to do? Look up. This is our command. In fact, in contrast to the unbeliever of this text, notice not only does the Christian not fear, but the Christian doesn't fear, but because this is what the Christian is looking for. Because this is where their hope is, right? In fact, let me just say that the Bible is an eschatological document, which means then that we live with an eschatological faith. By definition, we are to be forward-looking people at all times. We are to be a people whose hope and joy is not in the here and in the now, but in everything that is to come. And we don't have just a knowledge of what's to come. Here's the point. We have a living hope in what is to come, right? True hope. And biblical hope defined is not, I hope it's going to work out. We'll see, right? Rather, a biblical hope is the settled assurance of what is to come. Deep in the heart. In fact, let me just say that there are many joyless Christians, right? Maybe you know one or two. They just wander around, gloomy faces, hopeless, sour faces, woe is me, life's miserable, life stinks, people are awful, job's terrible, marriage isn't working out, kids cry all the time, people don't understand how to work a four-way stop. It's just whine, right? Just joyless, hopeless, critical, thankless. That's a lot of Christians. But the question is why? Let me show you. Turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. I was working through all these end times texts in the New Testament in preparation for this series. And this one forced me to slow down a little bit. fact, I was just sharing this one with one of the preaching classes this past Tuesday as we were thinking about the importance of observing themes and observing specific words in Scripture. But 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 5 through 10, Paul here is about to have his neck stretched out over the Roman block, and it will be severed from his body very shortly. And so he is writing to Timothy, his beloved son in the faith, and he is giving to him his final charge to be faithful, carry on this work. And as I told the class, some of the most shaping things in the Bible at times are just passing words, things our eyes just sort of gloss over. But he says these words in 2 Timothy 4, in verse 5, he says, "But you be sober in all things, endure hardship." That's a familiar language, right? "But endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me," and then here it is, "but also to all who have," what's the word? "Loved his appearing." Epiphaneia, epiphany. And the word that should stick out to you there is the word of love. That is an affectional term. Something from the heart. Notice it's not that he's going to award, he has a reward that is coming for those who know or believe in his appearing. Rather, it's those, underline the word, who have loved his appearing. And this isn't meant to guilt you. Just meant to get you to think. But can you say from the purity of your heart that you are right now a person who is loving the thought of his appearing? Or are you a person who's still got some things you want to get done in this life apart from the mission of Christ, and so you're pretty content if he delays? And here's what I want you to notice about this passage. Notice the contrast. Verse 8. "So in the future there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, not only to me, but also those who have loved his appearing." And then this, "So make every effort to come to me soon." Why? "For Demas," you know who Demas is. "But Demas, having" what? "Loved this present world, has deserted me." Who is Demas? Demas was a man who left the mission. Why? Because he fell back in love with his world. "Having loved this world, he has left me." And Demas, he started out well. Demas is mentioned in Colossians chapter 4 as a traveling companion to the Apostle Paul, who endured much hardship for the sake of the gospel. But what happened? With time, he fell back in love with his present world, which, by the way, never happens overnight, right? Rather, it happens slowly, little by little, as your heart and your joy and your loves and your desires and your affections begin to shift. And then they shift a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more. And so what I'm always trying to figure out as a pastor is why does this happen? Why do people come to faith or come into the church hot for Christ, and and hungry for his word, but with time, fade. They begin to drift. They begin to move to the fringes. Stop evangelizing, stop engaging the battle with the flesh, stop reading their Bibles, they stop praying, they stop being in true fellowship with people who will challenge them and confront them and encourage them and instruct them. They stop fighting the good fight. Why does this happen? Well, Paul gives the answer, and the answer here is bound up in the contrast with the word here of love. And because, again, it is always about what you're loving. How is it that you fall in love with this present world? It happens, beloved, by taking your eyes off of what? The appearing of Christ. And make no mistake, you don't take your eyes off of his appearing because you've fallen in love with his world. You fall in love with his world because you've taken your eyes off of his appearing. And now we're right back to the beginning where it is absolutely necessary then for us to maintain an eternal perspective. As a church, we need to move ourselves into becoming an eschatological people. We're not just looking for what Jesus can do for us in the here and the now. Our hope is primarily in everything to come, which is what makes then having to endure hardship okay. Our hope is in what's coming. Which, by the way, is why it is such a destructive thing when all people can do is just argue over eschatology. That is not the purpose of it. First of all, you're dealing with Jewish apocalyptic literature, which while it reveals truth, is also meant to hide it. But second of all, the purpose of eschatology is to get you to the end, still believing, still faithful, still hopeful, still fruitful, and keeping the affection of your heart beating for his return. That is its purpose. Why are Christians so hopeless and miserable at times? According to Paul, maybe it has something to do with the fact that we keep trying to make this world our home. In fact, some of you just keep setting your hope on something that is designed to fail you. And because it belongs to this age. Some of you are wearying yourselves to the bone over the bread that perishes. And you have all your plans, you have all your dreams, all your plots. And it'd all be fine except for the fact that it's pulling your heart away. Keeps clawing at you to take your eyes off the only thing that at the end of the day is going to matter, which is the end. And so you're stressed and you're anxious and you're weary. Maybe it's none of those things. Maybe you're so full of hope and joy and expectation of the things to come. But the problem is that your hope and joy and expectation is in everything in this world. And it's pulling your heart away. Not to say you're not a Christian, but it is to say that perhaps you need to examine your life and your heart and your priorities so that you don't become like Demas, who with time fell in love with his world and walked away. Apostatized. Some of you I know are weary from sin. Sin certainly within this world, but also sin within your own heart. And you hate it. Some of you are weary from a failing body. A body that's breaking down and living in rebellion against you. And you're weary from it. Some of you love your Lord and you're just grown weary of seeing his name dishonored and blasphemed and rejected by this world that's hostile to its maker and loves its sin. What is the point? Well, the point is that if you can train your mind and discipline your affections to get your eyes off of this world and onto what's to come, you're going to be a hopeful person. And dare I say, even joyful. A Christian is a person who loves the appearing of Christ. And why? Well, because in that moment, here's the point, in that moment, all that is wrong in this world and all that is broken is going to be righted in an instant. And he's going to come to his own and redeem them out, and he's going to call you home. It's Revelation 21, verses 1 through 7. Let me read it for you. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there's no longer any sea, where sea represents chaos in the scriptures. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride and adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain, for the first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. So then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the springs of the water of life without cost, and he who overcomes, endures, will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Question for us this morning is, do we love this? Or more to the point, do we love his appearing because we love him? Do you have a love for Christ? It's an affectional term. And do you love him because of what he's done for you and what he will do for you? What he did for you on the cross when he redeemed you and purchased you out of your sin. Do you have a love for him for that? And do you therefore long to see him praised and worshiped because he is worthy of all praise and worthy of all worship? It's the point of the text. The point of the text is that this is coming. This day is coming, whether you're ready or not. And one day, maybe even in our lifetimes, there will be the coming of the Son of Man. And while everything right now looks like it always has from the beginning, there's a day coming in which it won't. So do not let the regular patterns of this universe lull you into passivity. When this day comes, the day of the Lord, it will be accompanied by unmistakable, unprecedented events. And you're not going to miss it. But this is coming. And when it does, I tell you the truth, on that day, hear me, it will be all that will matter. All your anxieties, all your pursuits, everything you're losing sleep over right now will dissipate instantly. And then Jesus, the sovereign Lord of glory, will be the all-consuming and utter reality for you. Ready or not. So until that day, may we be faithful and done with lesser things. Your redemption is coming. And what a day it'll be. Let's pray.